The morning Marcus lost everything, he was still asleep. I remember standing in the kitchen at 5:43 a.m., watching the transfer confirmation load on my laptop screen. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that only exists after something irreversible has already happened. Elijah was upstairs 3 days out of surgery, breathing on his own for the first time without a machine helping him. And Marcus, my husband of 9 years, was in our bed, sleeping the way people sleep when they believe they have nothing to worry about. He had no idea what I had done the night before. No idea what was already in motion. No idea that by the time he showered and reached for his phone, the name on the company he built would no longer be his decision to carry. I poured my coffee. I did not shake. I did not cry. I had already done both of those things alone in a hospital waiting room while a surgeon cut open my 7-year-old son's chest and my husband's phone rang 11 times and went to voicemail every single time. This is the story of what happens when a man mistakes his wife's silence for weakness. Before we go any further, what time is it where you are right now? Drop your time and your country in the comments. I met Marcus Elliott Briggs at a fundraiser for Grady Hospital in the fall of 2014. He was standing near the bar in a charcoal suit that fit him the way suits fit men who know they're being watched. He had a laugh that carried across a room, warm and deliberate. The kind of laugh that makes strangers turn around. I was 31 years old, working as a financial analyst at a mid-sized investment firm on Peachtree Street. And I had attended the event alone because my colleague had canceled last minute and I had already paid for the ticket. He introduced himself. He said he was in commercial real estate and that he had a company he was trying to grow. I asked him what kind of growth he meant, organic or acquisition. He looked at me for a moment, like no one had ever asked him that at a fundraiser before. Then he smiled, not the performing smile from earlier, a different one. Smaller, realer. We talked for 2 hours. He walked me to my car. He asked for my number 3 separate times over the course of the evening before I gave it to him, and later he told me that the repetition was intentional, that he needed to know I was giving it because I wanted to, not because I felt pressured. I believed him. For a long time, I believed most of what Marcus told me. We dated for 2 years. I moved in after 14 months because it made financial sense. And because I was in love with him in the way you are in love when you are 32. And the person feels like the answer to a question you had stopped asking. We got married in October 2016 at a small venue in Decatur, 40 guests, no wedding planner, flowers. I arranged myself from a wholesale market in Chambly at 5 a.m. the morning of the ceremony. Elijah came in 2017. I still remember the exact weight of him, 6 pounds 14 ounces. He had Marcus's brow and my jaw, and a cry that sounded like an argument he had already decided to win. I took 12 weeks of leave and then went back to work because we needed the income, and because Marcus's company, Briggs Development Group, was still in the phase where it consumed more cash than it generated. I restructured my hours. I hired a part-time nanny 3 days a week. I did the math on everything, the mortgage on the house in Cascade Heights, the office lease Marcus had signed without telling me, the equipment loans, the payroll gap he hit every March without fail. I was good at math. What most people in our social circle did not know, what Marcus himself seemed to quietly forget over the years, was that I was the one managing the finances of Briggs Development Group. Not officially. My name was not on the website. I did not attend the client dinners or the golf weekends, or the ribbon-cutting events that Marcus photographed for Instagram with the caption, "Building something real." But every projection, every loan application, every tax filing, every quarterly report that left that office had passed through me first. I built the models. I caught the errors. I found the $340,000 accounting discrepancy in 2020 that would have triggered an IRS audit if I'd not restructured the reporting before the deadline. Marcus called me his secret weapon in private. In public, he called me his wife. I did not mind. I told myself that contribution does not require credit. I told myself that what we were building was shared, even if the visibility was not. I told myself a lot of things in those years that I have since stopped telling myself. Elijah was diagnosed with a congenital heart defect, a bicuspid aortic valve, at age 5 during a routine checkup. The pediatric cardiologist at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta explained it carefully twice with diagrams. She said it was manageable. She said that depending on how the valve developed, he might need intervention between ages 6 and 9. She said we would monitor it and make decisions together as a family. For 2 years, we monitored it. I attended every appointment. I kept a folder on my laptop, scans lab results, the cardiologist's notes, questions I had typed out the night before each visit. Marcus came to 3 of the 11 appointments. He was busy. He always had a reason that sounded reasonable until you added all the reasons together and looked at the sum. In January of this year, Dr. Anand called us in for a consultation. She said the valve was showing signs of stenosis. She said she wanted to schedule a repair procedure before Elijah turned 8. She said the window was ideal now, his size, his strength, the surgical team's availability. She gave us a date, March 4th. Marcus sat in that consultation room and held my hand and nodded at everything Dr. Anand said. He asked 2 questions. He seemed present. On the drive home, he said, "We'll get through this, Em." He said it like a man who intended to be there. I wrote the date on the whiteboard in the kitchen in red marker. March 4th, Elijah's surgery. I circled it. It stayed on that whiteboard for 6 weeks. The night before the surgery, Marcus kissed Elijah on the forehead and told him he would see him in the morning. Elijah was 7 years old and braver than either of us deserved. He said, "Okay, Dad." He said it without hesitation, the way children trust before they have been taught not to. I tucked Elijah in and sat beside his bed until he fell asleep. Then I went downstairs and found the house empty. Marcus had left while I was in Elijah's room. He had sent me a text that said, "Emergency work situation, won't be long." I stood in the kitchen and read that text 3 times. Then I went to the laundry room to move a load I had left in the dryer that morning, and when I pulled Marcus's jacket from the hamper to fold it, a receipt fell out of the breast pocket and landed face up on the floor. Aria Restaurant, Atlanta, March 3rd, 9:47 p.m. Table for 2, $340. I picked it up. I held it for a long time. Aria was where Marcus had taken me on our 3rd date. He had made a reservation 2 weeks in advance and told me to dress like I was worth the trouble. I had worn a green dress I still own. He had ordered for both of us without asking, and somehow gotten everything right. I set the receipt on top of the dryer. I finished folding the laundry. I turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs and lay down on my side of the bed and stared at the ceiling until 4 a.m. when my alarm went off, and it was time to get Elijah ready for the hospital. Marcus's side of the bed was empty to the bed. I have replayed the morning of March 4th more times than I can count. Not because I'm still hurting. I'm past that now mostly, but because there is something instructive in the details, something I want to hold on to so I never make the same mistake of filling in blanks with the best version of a person instead of the true one. I had been doing that for years with Marcus, handing him the benefit of every doubt like it was a gift he had earned. The morning of the surgery was the last time I did that. We were supposed to leave the house at 6 a.m. Elijah needed to be at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta on Clifton Road by 6:45 for pre-op check-in. I had confirmed this 3 times, once with the surgical coordinator, once with Dr. Anand's nurse, once by reading the printed instruction sheet I had pinned to the refrigerator 2 weeks prior. The sheet listed everything: arrival time, fasting instructions, what to bring, what to leave at home. I had followed every line. I woke Elijah at 5:15. He was quiet in the way children get quiet when they sense the adults around them are carrying something heavy. He let me help him dress without complaint, gray sweatpants, his NASA t-shirt, the one with the rocket on the chest that he had requested specifically because he said it would give him rocket courage. I packed his small backpack with his tablet, his headphones, and the stuffed dog he had named Gerald that he hadn't taken to school in 2 years, but still slept with every night. I carried him downstairs. I made him drink 4 ounces of apple juice before the fasting cutoff at 5:30. I braided his hair the way he liked it, 2 flat braids back neat. I did all of this alone. Marcus was not home. At 5:42 a.m., I called him for the first time. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I did not leave a message. I texted, "We leave in 18 minutes. Where are you?" No question mark. I had moved past the question by the time I typed it. At 5:51, I called again. Voicemail. At 6033 minutes past, when we should have already been in the car, I called a 3rd time. This time, it did not even ring. It went directly to voicemail, which meant he had seen my name and declined it manually. I stood in the hallway with my coat already on, and Elijah sitting on the bottom stair behind me, pulling on his sneakers. And I understood in that moment with a clarity I had been avoiding for months that Marcus was not coming. He had made a choice. It just wasn't the one he had told Elijah he would make. I loaded Elijah into the car. I drove the 4.2 miles to Children's Healthcare in 14 minutes because I had looked up the route the night before and identified a backup path in case of traffic. I pulled into the parking deck on level 2 because I had read in the parent packet that level 2 had the closest elevator to the surgical pre-op wing. I had prepared for everything, except the one variable I should have been most afraid of. At check-in, the intake coordinator, a woman in lavender scrubs with reading glasses on a beaded chain, asked me to confirm both parents were present, or if only one guardian would be signing the consent forms today. I said just me. She did not react. She had worked pediatric surgery long enough to have seen every configuration of family. She handed me the clipboard without a pause, and I signed my name on the line next to Emily Briggs. And I did not let my hand tremble. We were taken back to the pre-op bay at 7:10. Elijah was changed into a hospital gown, blue-printed with small cartoon dinosaurs that he studied with great seriousness before pronouncing the Stegosaurus inaccurate. A child life specialist came in with a tablet loaded with his favorite show. A nurse named Deja introduced herself and explained each step of what would happen in language calibrated exactly for a 7-year-old, and Elijah listened and nodded and asked 2 very specific questions about the anesthesia mask that impressed Deja enough that she called him a junior scientist. I sat in the chair beside his bed and held his hand and kept my phone face down on my lap. I had called Marcus 8 times by then. The last 3 had gone to voicemail without ringing. At 7:34, Dr. Anand came in for the pre-surgical briefing. She greeted Elijah first, always Elijah first, which is one of the reasons I trusted her completely. She went through the procedure. She asked if I had questions. I had written 3 in my notes app the night before, and I asked all 3. My voice was steady. I was in the room completely the way you learn to be when you understand that your child needs one present parent more than he needs 2 distracted ones. Dr. Anand asked gently if my husband would be joining us. I said he's on his way. I do not know why I said that. Old habit maybe. The muscle memory of covering for Marcus in public spaces, smoothing the edges of his absences so no one would look too closely at what was underneath. At 7:58, the transport team came for Elijah. He looked at me from the gurney with those big dark eyes, and he said, "Mom, will it hurt when I wake up?" I told him yes, a little. But that I would be there when he opened his eyes. That I would be the first thing he saw. That I promised. He said, "Okay." He reached for Gerald, the stuffed dog, and tucked it under his arm. They wheeled him through the double doors, and the doors swung shut behind him, and I stood in the hallway, and called Marcus for the 11th time. It rang once, then silent. I walked to the family waiting area, and I sat down in a chair by the window that looked out over a courtyard with a small fountain. I put my phone in my bag. I folded my hands in my lap, and I made myself a promise that was different from the one I had just made to Elijah, quieter and colder and absolutely certain. I had spent 9 years building something with a man who had just chosen on the morning our son went into cardiac surgery to be somewhere else with someone else. He could keep the absence. I was going to keep everything else. Elijah's surgery took 4 hours and 11 minutes. I know the exact duration because I watched the clock on the wall of the family waiting area with a kind of focus you develop when there is nothing else your body will allow you to do. The clock had a small crack in the upper left corner of its plastic casing. I memorized that crack. I memorized the pattern of the carpet beneath my feet. Burgundy diamonds on a cream background worn thin in the path between the chairs and the coffee station. I memorized the sound of the automatic doors at the end of the hall, the particular exhale they made each time someone passed through. I did not look at my phone. I had stopped calling Marcus after the 11th attempt. Not because I had given up hope that he would appear. I think some part of me, the part that had loved him for 9 years, was still waiting for the sound of his footsteps coming down that hallway. But because I understood that calling him again would cost me something I could not afford to spend, I needed everything I had for the room behind those double doors, for Elijah. 3 other families occupied the waiting area during those 4 hours. A grandmother with a rosary who never stopped moving her lips. A young couple, early 20s, holding hands so tightly their knuckles had gone pale, whose toddler was somewhere in the building, having ear tubes placed. A man in a Falcons jacket who fell asleep in his chair within 20 minutes and snored softly through most of the morning, which I found strangely comforting. Normal human sounds in an abnormal space. A hospital chaplain came by at 9 a.m. and asked if I needed anything. I said no. She sat with me anyway for about 12 minutes without speaking, which was exactly the right thing to do, and then she moved on. At 11:43 a.m., Dr. Anand came through the double doors. She was still in her surgical cap. She was smiling, not the broad smile of relief, but the contained professional smile of someone who has good news and is practiced at delivering it at the correct volume. She sat down across from me and folded her hands and said everything went well. The valve repair was clean. He's in recovery. He did beautifully. I said thank you. I said it twice. I pressed my hands flat against my thighs to keep them still. She said I could see him in approximately 40 minutes once he was settled in the pediatric ICU. She asked again as she stood to leave whether my husband had made it. I said he had been held up. I said he would be here soon. She nodded the way people nod when they are too professional to say what they are thinking. Then she walked back through the double doors, and I sat alone in the waiting area with the grandmother and her rosary and the snoring man in the Falcons jacket, and I allowed myself exactly 90 seconds to feel everything I had been holding at arm's length all morning. Then I picked up my phone. There was one text from Marcus. Sent at 10:17 a.m., nearly 3 hours after Elijah had gone into surgery, nearly 4 hours after I had last spoken to him. It said, something came up. How is he? 3 words, a period instead of a question mark. I read it 4 times. I set the phone face down on the seat beside me. Then I picked it up again and opened a different app. Not my messages, not my email. I opened the secure document portal for Whitfield & Associates, the law firm on West Peachtree I had first contacted 14 months earlier. I logged in with my credentials, and I reviewed for what was perhaps the 20th time the documents that had been sitting in that portal, fully executed and ready since November of last year. I want to explain something about those documents, about the 14 months. I did not wake up one morning and decide to dismantle Marcus's life. That is not what happened, and I will not let the story be told that way. What happened was slower and more painful than that. What happened was that I had been watching Marcus change over the course of 3 years, watching his absences accumulate, watching the explanations get thinner, watching him look at me across the dinner table with an expression I can only describe as tolerating something that used to interest him. I had asked him twice directly if there was someone else. Both times he had been offended. Both times he had turned it around, until I was the one apologizing. I did not go to a lawyer out of revenge. I went to a lawyer because I had built something, and I needed to understand what I actually owned. What I learned over those 14 months with Whitfield and Associates was more than I had expected. Because of my role, managing the finances of Briggs Development Group, because my name was on documents, because I had signed off on filings, because there existed a paper trail going back 7 years of my material contribution to the company's financial operations, I had legal grounds to claim an interest in the business. My attorney, a woman named Patricia Whitfield, who wore reading glasses on a chain almost identical to the intake coordinators, and who had 30 years of family and business law in Atlanta, had structured it carefully. In 2022, I had established an LLC, Cascade Financial Consulting LLC, through which I had formalized several of the financial services I had been providing to Briggs Development Group. Marcus had reviewed and signed a service and equity agreement that year. He had read it the way busy people read documents they trust the other person to have handled correctly, skimming, initialing, moving on. He had signed over a 51% equity stake in a holding structure that Patricia had spent 4 months building. He thought he was signing a tax efficiency document. I had not lied to him. I had simply presented it at a moment when he was not paying attention, which by 2022 was most moments. I want to be clear. Patricia had advised me on legality at every step. Every document was sound. Every signature was voluntary. Marcus had been given the opportunity to have his own counsel review the agreement. He had declined, said he trusted me, and initialed the last page while watching a game on his phone. I had sat across from him at the kitchen table and watched him do it. I had felt nothing in particular at the time. I had filed the documents away and gone back to making dinner. And I had told myself I was simply protecting myself, that I hoped I would never need to use it, that maybe things would get better. Things did not get better. I was sitting in the pediatric ICU at 12:34 p.m., holding Elijah's small hand while he slept off the anesthesia when Marcus finally walked through the door. He was in the same clothes from the day before. His shirt was slightly wrinkled at the collar, in the specific way shirts wrinkle when they have been taken off and put back on. He smelled of a cologne. I did not recognize something lighter than what he usually wore. Something that would have been chosen by someone younger who liked sweeter things. He stood at the foot of Elijah's bed and looked at our sun tubes and monitors and the small rise and fall of his chest, and something moved across Marcus's face that I chose in that moment to believe was genuine. He said, "Is he okay?" I said, "He's fine." Surgery went well. He came through clean. Marcus exhaled. He put his hand on the bed rail. He said, "I'm sorry I couldn't get here sooner." I looked at him for a long moment. He was still wearing the silver watch his father had given him, the one he never took off. The face of it caught the light from the window. I said, "Okay." Just that. One word. I turned back to Elijah, and I did not say anything else to Marcus for the rest of the afternoon, and he seemed to mistake my silence for forgiveness, which was the last mistake he ever made about me. We brought Elijah home on March 7th. 3 days in the pediatric ICU, then a step-down room, then discharge with a folder of aftercare instructions, a prescription for 2 medications, and a follow-up appointment scheduled for April 3rd. Deja, the nurse who had impressed Elijah before surgery, was on shift the morning we left, and she gave him a small stuffed animal, a lion, which he immediately named Gerald II, and announced would be Gerald's security detail. I carried Elijah to the car because the discharge instructions said limited exertion for 2 weeks, and he was not to navigate stairs or inclines unassisted. He weighed 54 pounds. I carried him without difficulty. Marcus carried the bag. The drive home was quiet in the way drives are quiet when 2 people have run out of performance. Elijah fell asleep before we reached I-85. Marcus drove. I sat in the back beside Elijah's car seat and watched the city move past the window and thought about nothing, which is what I do when I'm actually thinking about everything. At home, I settled Elijah into the downstairs guest room we had converted to a temporary bedroom so he would not have to manage the stairs. I arranged his medications on the nightstand with a handwritten schedule. I put Gerald and Gerald 2 on either side of his pillow. I downloaded 3 new episodes of his favorite show onto the tablet and set the brightness to low. I did all of this with the focused efficiency of someone who has decided that love is a set of actions, and actions are the only currency that matters. Marcus stood in the doorway of the room for a while, watching. Then he went upstairs. I heard him in the shower. I heard the television come on in our bedroom. I heard the particular creak of the 3rd floorboard in the hall, the one I had asked him to fix for 2 years, as he moved around up there, living his life with the easy assumption that I was downstairs living mine in support of his. I sat at the kitchen table. The house was the same house it had always been. 11-year-old Craftsman in Cascade Heights, original hardwood floors that we had refinished in 2019, the kitchen renovation we had done in phases because we could not afford it all at once, and I had project managed it myself to save the contractor markup. I had picked every fixture, every tile, every cabinet pull. I had spent 3 Saturdays driving between showrooms on Howell Mill Road, comparing grout colors, because Marcus said he trusted my eye, and then complained when I chose a warm gray instead of a cool one. I looked at the kitchen, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not anger, not grief, but a kind of clean, clear recognition. This was mine. All of it, the work, the decisions, the maintenance, the financial architecture underneath. Everything we called our life together. It had always been mine. I had simply been sharing credit with someone who had grown careless with it. I opened my laptop. The email from Patricia Whitfield had arrived that afternoon, time-stamped 3:47 p.m. She had been waiting for Elijah's discharge before sending it. It contained 1 sentence and 1 attachment. The sentence said, "Ready when you are." The attachment was a consolidated summary of every document, every filing, every executed agreement organized in chronological order with annotations in the margins. I read it from beginning to end. I had read it before many times. But I read it again that night because I needed to feel the solidity of it, the way a person checks a locked door. Not because they doubt the lock, but because certainty is its own kind of comfort. At 11:48 p.m., Marcus came downstairs. He was in a t-shirt and basketball shorts, the domestic version of himself that I had once found endearing, the big man reduced to soft clothes and bare feet on hardwood. He opened the refrigerator, stood in its light for a moment, closed it without taking anything. Then he noticed me at the table. He said, "You're still up?" I said yes. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. He looked at the laptop screen, which I had angled slightly away from him. He looked at my face, which I had arranged into something neutral. He said, "Emily, I know you're upset." I did not say anything. He said, "I messed up. I know that. But I'm here now, and Elijah is home." And I said, "What's her name?" Not a question. A statement I already knew the answer to and wanted him to hear himself say. He went very still. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere upstairs, the 3rd floorboard creaked in the thermal settling of the house. He said, "It's not what I said her name." He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He said a name, Amber, in a voice so reduced it was barely sound. like the name itself had weight he had not anticipated carrying in this room, in this light across this table from me. I nodded. I closed the laptop. I stood up and pushed in my chair with the same care I always used, the same deliberate quiet, and I said, "Get some sleep, Marcus." I walked upstairs. I checked on Elijah once more, his breathing even, on Gerald tucked under his arm, Gerald too stationed faithfully beside the pillow. I stood in the doorway of that room for a long moment, and I felt the specific love that exists only between a parent and a child who has just survived something enormous, clear, and unconditional, in a way that nothing else in my life had ever managed to be. Then I went to the bedroom. Marcus's side of the bed was empty. He had stayed downstairs. I sat on the edge of the mattress, and I picked up my phone, and I typed one text to Patricia Whitfield. It said, "Tomorrow morning. Move forward." I set the phone on the nightstand face down. I lay down. I closed my eyes. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I fell asleep quickly and without difficulty, the way you sleep when every decision has already been made and all that remains is the morning. The next 3 weeks were the quietest I have ever been in my life. Not quiet because there was nothing happening. The opposite. Patricia and her team were moving through documents the way a surgical team moves through a procedure. Precise, unhurried each step, creating the condition for the next. I had a call with her every morning at 7:15 a.m. while Elijah slept and Marcus was in the shower. I took those calls in the backyard, standing near the old oak tree in the corner that had been there since before the house was built, in whatever weather March in Atlanta decided to offer. Some mornings it was cold enough to see my breath. I did not mind. Marcus noticed nothing. This, I have come to understand, was not stupidity on his part. It was the particular blindness that develops in men who have decided their wives are scenery. I had become so efficient at managing our life, so seamless, so self-contained, that my continued functioning read to him as normalcy. I made Elijah's meals. I administered his medications on schedule. I managed the follow-up calls with Dr. Anand's office. I sent the insurance claims. I answered Marcus's work emails when he forwarded them to me with a note that said, "Can you handle this the way he had done for 6 years?" And I handled them because stopping abruptly would have been a signal. And I was not ready to send signals yet. I was in a different phase. I was in the phase of watching. Marcus, during those 3 weeks, was not careful. I think he believed that the conversation at the kitchen table, the one where he had said her name in that collapsed voice, had functioned as a confession that reset the account. That acknowledgement was the same as repair. He brought home flowers, once grocery store tulips, in a paper sleeve, and set them on the counter without ceremony, which was how Marcus did most things he wanted credit for, without ceremony. So that if you did not receive it as a gesture, he could claim it had simply been flowers. He was on his phone more than usual. Not differently, he had always been on his phone. But I was watching differently now. I noticed the angle at which he held the screen. I noticed when he left the room to take calls. I noticed that he had begun charging his phone on the kitchen counter overnight instead of on his nightstand, which he had never done before, which meant he had decided the bedroom was too close. I did not investigate. I did not need evidence. I had made my decision at the kitchen table, and it was not contingent on accumulating more proof of what I already knew. What I was watching for was the business. Briggs Development Group had a major meeting scheduled for March 28th. I knew this because I had been managing Marcus's professional calendar for 4 years, and the March 28th meeting had been on it since November. It was a presentation to a group of institutional investors, 3 firms based in Atlanta, 1 out of Charlotte, who were considering a significant capital infusion into Briggs's commercial portfolio. Marcus had been preparing for this meeting for months. He had hired a presentation consultant. He had new slides made. He had bought a new suit. The meeting was the reason Patricia had structured the timeline the way she had. On March 19th, with Elijah napping and Marcus at his office, I drove to West Peachtree and sat across from Patricia Whitfield in her conference room on the 14th floor, and we reviewed the final sequence. She was wearing a dark green blazer and the reading glasses on the beaded chain, and an expression of complete professional calm that I found deeply reassuring. She had done this before. Not this exactly, but the architecture of it, the careful legal dismantling of an arrangement that one party had taken for granted for too long. She walked me through each step: the board notification, the shareholder meeting, the transfer of operational authority. She explained what Marcus would be told, and when and by whom. I asked her one question: is everything clean? She said completely. I drove home. That evening, Marcus came home at 7 p.m. in a good mood, the expansive, self-congratulatory mood of a man who believes a large thing is about to go well for him. He talked about the investor meeting over dinner. He talked about the capital infusion, about what it would mean for the company's expansion into the mixed-use market, about a building in Midtown he had his eye on. He talked with the specific enthusiasm of a man who had forgotten temporarily that his marriage was in a particular condition because his professional life was about to peak. And professional peaks had always been sufficient to reset Marcus's emotional accounting. I listened. I asked a question or two. I kept my face at the same temperature it had been for 3 weeks. After dinner, Marcus helped Elijah with a puzzle, a 100-piece map of the United States that Elijah had been working on since coming home from the hospital, insisting on finding each state himself without assistance. Marcus sat on the floor beside him and handed him pieces and made the sounds of a patient father. And Elijah leaned against his arm, the way children lean against the people they love, before they are old enough to know those people are complicated. And I stood in the kitchen doorway and watched them, and felt something that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but existed in the space between the two. Then Marcus's phone lit up on the coffee table. He reached for it with the speed of someone who had been waiting for it. He read something. Something moved across his face, quick, involuntary, the micro-expression of a man receiving exactly what he wanted. He typed a response. He set the phone face down. He looked up and found me watching him from the doorway. He said, "Work stuff." I said, "I know." He held my gaze for a moment, trying to read me the way he had always tried to read me, looking for the emotion on the surface, missing the architecture underneath. Then he looked back at Elijah and the puzzle. "Dad," Elijah said, holding up a piece, "where does Montana go?" Marcus pointed to the upper left. "Right up there, buddy. Big state. Is it bigger than Georgia? Way bigger. Then why does Georgia feel more important?" Marcus laughed, that room-carrying laugh, the one that had made me turn around at a fundraiser 11 years ago. He said, "Because you live here, that's why." Elijah considered this with the seriousness it deserved, and then placed Montana in the correct position and moved on. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed and I opened my laptop. And I sent Patricia one email. 3 words, March 28th. Confirmed. Then I heard Marcus's voice from downstairs, lower now, the register he used when he thought he was alone. Not words, just tone. Warm and easy, in a way it had not been with me in longer than I wanted to calculate. I closed the laptop. I went to check on Elijah one final time. He had fallen asleep on the living room floor with his cheek on Gerald, and 3 states still missing from his puzzle. Montana placed correctly, Wyoming beside it, and a gap where Colorado should have been. I found Colorado under the couch. I placed it in the map myself. Then I turned off the light and went to bed. And I did not sleep for a long time, not because I was uncertain, but because there is a particular kind of wakefulness that comes the night before something large and irreversible. And I had learned by then to simply lie in it and let it pass. By the time Marcus came upstairs at 1 a.m., I was breathing slowly and evenly, and my eyes were closed. He stood in the doorway for a moment. I could feel him there. Then he crossed to his side of the bed and lay down, and within 4 minutes, he was asleep, which was something Marcus had always been able to do, fall into sleep like it owed him nothing. I lay beside him in the dark, and I thought about the morning. 8 days. March 28th arrived, the way significant days always do. Ordinary on the surface, unremarkable in its weather, indifferent to what it was about to carry. Atlanta was overcast. Not raining, just that flat gray sky that sits over the city sometimes in late March, like it cannot decide whether spring has earned its full arrival yet. I was up at 5:30 a.m. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the oak tree in the backyard move slightly in wind. I could not hear through the glass. And I felt the specific calm of a person who has prepared so thoroughly that the preparation has become its own form of peace. Marcus was upstairs getting ready. He had laid his new suit out the night before, charcoal wool slim cut purchased from a tailor on Ponce de Leon that he had discovered 2 years ago and visited exclusively since. He had polished his shoes himself, which he only did for significant occasions. He had set 2 alarms and silenced both before either went off, which meant he had been awake before them, running the day in his head the way people run important days before they begin. I heard him moving through the bedroom, the shower, the particular sound of his cologne being applied, 3 short bursts, always 3. The closet, the creak of the 3rd floorboard that he still had not fixed. He came downstairs at 7:15, looking the way Marcus looked when he was feeling formidable. The suit was good. The shoes caught light. He had the energy of a man walking towards something he believed was already his. He said, "I'll be late tonight. The investor dinner goes until at least 9. I said, "Okay." He poured himself a coffee to go. He checked his phone. He straightened his cuffs. He said, "Wish me luck." I looked at him from across the kitchen. 9 years of mornings. 9 years of watching this man move through rooms like he was the most important thing in them. He was wearing the silver watch his father had given him, always the watch, always. That particular inheritance on his wrist, like it meant something about who he was. I said, "You won't need it." He smiled. He took it as encouragement. He kissed me on the cheek, the automatic kiss of long habit, the kind that has lost its intention but retained its motion, and then he was gone. The front door closed. His car started in the driveway. I listened to it back out and move down the street. And then I listened to the neighborhood quiet that followed. And then I picked up my phone and texted Patricia. "He just left," she replied in under a minute. "We're already there." I need to explain what Patricia had built because it matters. Briggs Development Group had a board of directors, technically. Marcus had established it 3 years earlier at the suggestion of a business consultant who told him institutional investors would take him more seriously if there was governance structure in place. The board had 3 members at the time of the March 28th meeting. Marcus himself, a childhood friend named Darnell, who ran an HVAC company and attended board meetings as a favor, and a commercial real estate attorney named Howard Webb, who had been a passive participant since his appointment and had in the intervening years developed significant reservations about the direction of the company's financial management. Howard Webb was one of Patricia's colleagues. Not a conflict, they operated in different practice areas, different firms, but known to each other. Professional Atlanta is in certain circles a small city. Patricia had spent the weeks following my text tomorrow morning. Move forward, executing a sequence I will describe as cleanly as I can. Cascade Financial Consulting, LLC, which held the 51% equity stake Marcus had signed over in 2022, had formally notified the Briggs Development Group board of its majority ownership position. This notification, which was legally required under the operating agreement Marcus had signed, had been delivered to Howard Webb and Darnell on March 21st. Howard, who had been concerned about the company's governance for over a year, had found the notification clarifying. Darnell, who was loyal to Marcus but not unconditionally, had called me directly the evening of March 22nd. That call had lasted 47 minutes. I had taken it in the backyard, standing near the oak tree in the dark. Darnell was not angry. He was, I think, mostly not surprised. He had known Marcus longer than I had, and he understood with the resigned clarity of lifelong friendship that Marcus had a particular blindness about the structures that supported him. He asked me one question, "Is Elijah okay?" I said, "He's getting stronger every day." Darnell said, "Okay then." And that was the end of the conversation about anything other than the procedural steps which Patricia had briefed him on, and which he was prepared to follow. By March 25th, Patricia had also executed the second component of the plan, the part Marcus had not anticipated, because it required knowing something about the investor meeting that he did not know she knew. The 3 Atlanta-based investment firms scheduled to attend the March 28th meeting had each received through proper channels a disclosure document from Cascade Financial Consulting, LLC, informing them of the ownership structure of Briggs Development Group, prior to any capital agreement being signed. This was not a hostile act. It was a legal requirement under securities guidelines for any significant equity transaction. Patricia had simply ensured it happened before Marcus walked into the room rather than after. 2 of the 3 Atlanta firms had responded to the disclosure with requests to delay the meeting pending clarification of governance structure. 1 had not responded at all. The Charlotte firm had withdrawn entirely on March 26th. Marcus did not know any of this when he kissed me on the cheek and drove away in his polished shoes. I spent the morning with Elijah. We worked on a new puzzle, 200 pieces this time, and a map of the world that he had requested specifically because he wanted to know where all the countries were. We worked at the kitchen table with the morning light coming through the window over the sink and Gerald stationed on the chair beside him as an observer. Elijah asked questions about countries as he found them. Why is Russia so big? Is Australia an island or a continent? Why is Greenland called green if it's mostly ice? I answered each one as fully as I could, and when I did not know, I said I did not know. And we looked it up together on my phone. At 9:47 a.m., my phone buzzed. A text from Patricia. "He's in the building." I put the phone face down and helped Elijah find Iceland. At 10:03 a.m., another text board is convened. "Howard has the floor." I found Greenland myself and set it in front of Elijah without comment, which he accepted without question, already absorbed in the coastline of South America. At 10:31 a.m., Patricia called. I stepped into the hallway and answered. She said, "Emily, it's done. The board has voted to transition executive leadership of Briggs Development Group, effective immediately. Howard is serving as interim CEO pending formal appointment. Marcus has been informed." I said, "How did he take it?" She said, "About how you'd expect." I asked, "Is he on his way here?" She said, "I would assume so, yes." I thanked her. I hung up. I stood in the hallway for a moment with my back against the wall and my phone in my hand, and I breathed in and breathed out and let the magnitude of it move through me without attaching to it. Then I heard Elijah from the kitchen. He said, "Mom, I found Antarctica. It's at the bottom." I said, "That's exactly where it is." He said, "It doesn't look like it belongs with the other continents." I walked back into the kitchen and looked at the puzzle and at my son and at the morning light on the table. I said, "Some things take a while to find their place." He considered this and placed Antarctica at the bottom of the board, slightly crooked, which he immediately noticed and corrected with the careful hands of a child who understands that precision matters. Outside, a car turned onto our street. I recognized the sound of the engine. Marcus came through the front door at 10:54 a.m. I know the time because I looked at the clock on the microwave when I heard his key in the lock, a habit I had developed over 9 years of tracking the hours of a man who was frequently somewhere other than where he said he would be. The clock read 10:54, Elijah was still at the kitchen table with his puzzle absorbed in the coastline of West Africa. I was standing at the counter with a glass of water I'd poured and not yet drunk. The door opened, then closed. Hard, not a slam, but the particular forceful pull of a man who is containing something and not entirely succeeding. I heard him in the entryway. The sound of his keys hitting the bowl on the console table louder than usual. The sound of him breathing. Then his footsteps on the hardwood, not the easy stride of a man coming home at the end of a normal day, but something faster and less controlled, the gait of someone who has spent 40 minutes in a car with nowhere to put what they are carrying. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was still in the suit. The charcoal wool that had looked so deliberate this morning looked different now, the jacket slightly off its axis, the collar of his shirt open at the top. Button the polished shoes carrying a scuff on the left toe that had not been there at 7:15. He looked like a man who had walked out of a room before the room was finished with him. He looked at me. He said, "Elijah, buddy, can you go watch your show in the other room for a little while?" Elijah looked up from the puzzle. He looked at his father. He looked at me. He was 7 years old and 3 weeks out of cardiac surgery and more perceptive than either of us had ever given him credit for. He picked up Gerald from the neighboring chair, tucked him under his arm, and slid off his seat without a word. He paused in the doorway on his way out and looked back at the puzzle at Antarctica correctly placed at the bottom, and then he walked down the hall to the family room, and the sound of his tablet starting up drifted back to us a moment later. Marcus waited until he heard it. Then he turned to me and said, "What did you do?" Not a question. The same structure I had used with him at the kitchen table 2 weeks earlier, when I had said her name in a voice that was not asking. He had learned the grammar of certainty from watching me use it. I set the glass of water on the counter. I said what I was entitled to do. He moved into the kitchen. Not toward me, he stopped at the island, put both hands flat on the granite surface and looked at me across it, the way people look at things they're trying to make legible. He said, "You went to my board. You sent disclosures to my investors. Do you understand what you've done?" The Charlotte Group pulled out. 2 of the Atlanta firms are in delay. I walked into that room and Howard Webb. He stopped. He pressed his hands harder into the granite. Howard looked at me like I was a guest. I said, "You were." He stared at me. I said, "You have been a guest in that company for 4 years, Marcus. I built the financial architecture that made it fundable. I wrote the models that made those investors interested in the first place. I caught the discrepancy in 2020 that would have ended the company before this conversation ever happened. The equity agreement you signed in 2022 was legal, it was voluntary, and you had every opportunity to have it reviewed." He said, "I trusted you." I said, "I know." The word landed in the room between us, and neither of us moved for a moment. He said, "You did this because of Amber." I said, "I did this because of me." He pushed off the island. He started pacing the short, contained pacing of a man in a room too small for what he is feeling. He said, "Emily, listen to me. Whatever is happening between us, that's separate. That's personal. You do not blow up a company over something personal. People work there. There are contracts, there are projects in progress, there are..." I said, "I know exactly what is in progress. I have managed the operational calendar of that company for 4 years. Howard Webb has been briefed. The transition plan Patricia's team drafted ensures continuity on every active project. No one is losing their job. No contract is in breach. The company is fine, Marcus. You are simply no longer running it." He stopped pacing. He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, not anger, not hurt, but something that existed underneath both of those things. A kind of exposure. The look of a man who has just understood for the first time the actual dimensions of the thing he had been standing on. He said, "How long?" I said, "The LLC was established in 2022. The legal framework took 14 months to complete." He said, 14 months. I said, "Yes." He sat down. Not at the island. He moved to the kitchen table, the table where we had eaten 9 years of dinners, where Elijah had just been placing continents in their correct positions. And he sat down in the chair that still had the indentation of Elijah's weight in the cushion. He sat there in his good suit with his polished shoes and his silver watch, and he looked at the unfinished puzzle on the table in front of him. Antarctica at the bottom. West Africa found and placed. A gap where the Indian Ocean islands should be. He said, "I don't understand you." I said, "I know that too." He said, "I thought." He stopped. He started again. "I thought you were handling it the way you always handle things." "I thought you were," I said, "waiting for you to come back." He looked up. I said I was for a long time. And then I stopped and I started building something that didn't require you to show up. He was quiet for a long time. The tablet sound drifted in from the family room, some cheerful animated music that belonged to a completely different morning than the one we were having. Outside, the overcast sky had not changed. Atlanta still undecided about the season. Then Marcus said something I had not expected. He said the watch. I looked at him. He was looking at his wrist, at the silver watch his father had given him. He turned it slightly, the way he did sometimes when he was thinking a small, unconscious rotation, the face catching light. He said, "My father gave me this the day I signed the papers on the first Briggs project." He said it was to remind me what I was building for. He paused. I don't think I remembered that. I stopped. He stopped again. I did not fill the silence for him. That was a thing I had done for 9 years, filled the silences Marcus left behind, because I was faster and more articulate, and because I had mistaken finishing his sentences for closeness. I did not do it this time. I stood at the counter and I let him find or not find his own words. He did not find them. He sat at the table with his hands in his lap and his eyes on the puzzle, and he did not say anything else for a long time. From the family room, Elijah laughed at something on his tablet. A bright, uncomplicated sound, full of the specific joy of a child who has survived something difficult and come out the other side and does not yet fully understand what that means, but feels it in his body as lightness. Marcus heard it. Something in his face shifted, cracked open slightly the way faces do when they receive something they know they do not deserve. I picked up my glass of water. I drank it. I said, "There are divorce papers in Patricia Whitfield's office. You'll receive them by end of day. She's made the process as clean as the rest of it." He said, "Emily." I said, "Elijah is healing. He's going to be fine. You can be his father. That is not part of any document. That is yours to decide every day going forward." I set the glass in the sink. I walked past the kitchen table, past Marcus in his good suit, past the unfinished puzzle with its missing Indian Ocean islands. And I walked down the hallway to the family room where my son was lying on his stomach, watching his show with Gerald under his chin, and Gerald too standing watch nearby. I sat down on the floor beside him. He shifted to make room without looking up the automatic accommodation of a child who is used to his mother beside him. On the screen, a cartoon explorer was mapping an unknown coastline, narrating each discovery in a voice of pure, unironic wonder. Behind me in the kitchen, I heard Marcus stand up. I heard the scrape of the chair. I heard his footsteps slower now, less certain than the ones that had brought him through the door 40 minutes ago. I heard the front door open, then close, quietly this time. The divorce papers reached Marcus at 4:47 p.m. that same day. Patricia's paralegals sent them by courier to the Briggs Development Group office, which was still technically Marcus's address of record for legal correspondence, and then sent a duplicate set to the Cascade Heights house by certified mail. Patricia had told me she preferred redundancy in delivery, that in her experience, people in Marcus's situation had a tendency to later claim they had not received things they very much had received, and she liked to foreclose that possibility entirely. I was in the backyard with Elijah when the courier arrived. We were doing what the discharge instructions called light outdoor activity. Elijah sitting in the Adirondack chair with a blanket over his lap, me on the grass nearby. Both of us watching a pair of cardinals argue over the feeder I had hung from the oak tree the previous spring. Elijah had named both cardinals. The male was Gerald III. The female, he had decided, after significant deliberation, was Patricia. I had not told him why I found that particular. The certified mail notice was left in the mailbox. I retrieved it later after Elijah was inside. I held the yellow slip and looked at Marcus's name printed in the courier's handwriting, and then I put it in the kitchen drawer where I kept important documents. And I made dinner. Marcus did not come home that night. He did not come home the night after or the night after that. He called once the second evening, and I answered, and he said he was staying at a hotel. And I said, okay. And he said he needed some time to process everything. And I said I understood. And he said he would call about Elijah soon. And I said that would be good. And we hung up, and I stood in the kitchen for a moment. And then I finished what I was doing, which was folding laundry. What I did not know during those first days was the speed at which the information was moving. Atlanta, as I have said, is a small city in certain circles. The commercial real estate and investment community in Midtown and Buckhead operates on the same informal networks. It always has dinners, golf, the particular currency of knowing things before they are announced. The disclosure documents Patricia had sent to the investor firms had been seen by people beyond their intended recipients. The board transition at Briggs Development Group had been noted. By the end of March 28th, Howard Webb had received 3 calls from people in the industry asking with varying degrees of discretion what had happened. Howard, to his credit, said nothing beyond what was legally required. He confirmed the transition of leadership. He confirmed the company was operationally stable. He did not discuss Marcus or the circumstances. He was a professional and he behaved like one. But information does not require a single source to travel. By March 30th, 2 days after the board meeting, Marcus's phone had received 41 calls. I know this because Darnell told me later in one of the conversations we continued to have, in the weeks that followed, conversations that surprised me with their frankness and their lack of drama. Darnell said Marcus had called him 17 times in the first 24 hours. He said he had answered 4 of them. By April 1st, the situation had clarified itself along lines I had anticipated, but not fully mapped. The first line was professional. The 2 Atlanta investment firms that had requested delays following the disclosure sent formal notices through their attorneys withdrawing from the March 28th transaction. Their reasoning, as stated in the withdrawal letters, cited governance uncertainty and undisclosed equity structure. These were legitimate legal reasons. They were also the natural consequence of a man who had been presenting himself as the sole decision-maker of a company he did not in fact control. The second line was social. Marcus had a particular position in Atlanta's black professional community, not prominent exactly, but visible. He attended events. He was on the email lists. He had been photographed at galas and charity auctions and ribbon cuttings. And his Instagram had 200 followers who knew him as a man building something real. Within the first week of April, 3 people who had been in his regular orbit had quietly redirected their professional courtesies. A lunch that had been on the calendar for 2 weeks was canceled without rescheduling. An introduction that had been promised through a mutual connection did not materialize. Small withdrawals, each individually deniable, collectively unmistakable. The third line was Amber. I learned what happened there, not from Marcus, and not from anyone who knew either of them directly, but from a woman named Keisha, who had been at Spelman with me and had apparently known Amber peripherally through a gym they both attended in Midtown. Keisha called me on April 3rd, the same day as Elijah's first post-surgical follow-up, which went beautifully, Dr. Anand, pronouncing the repair clean and the valve functioning correctly, and Elijah's recovery ahead of schedule. Keisha said she was calling because she had heard things, and she wanted to know if I was okay, and she wanted me to know that she was in my corner regardless. I thanked her. Then, because Keisha has always been constitutionally incapable of not telling the whole story, she told me what she knew about Amber. Amber had ended contact with Marcus within 48 hours of March 28th. Keisha did not know the specific reason, whether Amber had learned about the board transition through her own channels, or whether Marcus himself had told her, or whether she had simply read the room and made a calculation. But the contact had stopped. Keisha had heard this from two separate people. She said Amber had, by all accounts, moved with considerable efficiency. I said good for her. Keisha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Emily, you doing okay for real?" I was sitting in the parking deck of Children's Healthcare of Atlanta Level 2 near the elevator. Elijah was in the back seat with his discharge summary and a sticker of a lion that Deja had given him, which he was pressing with great care onto the cover of his World puzzle box. I said, "I'm doing okay, for real." She said, "What you did was, the LLC, Patricia Whitfield." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh. "Emily," I said. I just paid attention. She said, "For 14 months. I said, "For 9 years. 14 months is just when I started writing it down." The thing about a domino effect is that each tile only falls because the previous one was already moving. Marcus's professional situation deteriorated, not because I had orchestrated its deterioration, but because the architecture of what he had built, the part of it that was genuinely his, had been resting on assumptions that were no longer operative. He had assumed I would continue to manage the financial infrastructure of the company regardless of what happened between us. He had assumed the board was nominal. He had assumed the investors were committed on the basis of his personal relationships. He had assumed the version of himself that existed in Atlanta's professional imagination was stable and self-sustaining. None of those assumptions had been tested, because I'd been quietly ensuring they did not need to be. When I stopped ensuring it, the testing happened naturally and rapidly. By April 15th, the company's operational accounts, which Marcus had attempted to access using credentials that Cascade Financial Consulting LLC, as majority shareholder, had legally revoked following the board transition, were restructured under Howard's authority. Marcus's attorney sent a letter contesting the revocation. Patricia's response was 14 pages and cited the operating agreement Marcus had signed in 2022 in its entirety. Marcus's attorney did not send a follow-up letter. By April 20th, Marcus had moved out of the hotel and into an apartment in Sandy Springs that he had found through a real estate agent Darnell had recommended. It was a 2-bedroom on the 4th floor with a balcony that faced north. I know this because Marcus told Elijah about the balcony during their first phone call. Elijah had asked if there was outside, and Marcus had said yes, there was outside, and Elijah had said he wanted to see it when he was better, and Marcus had said, "Of course, whenever you're ready, buddy." I was in the hallway when that conversation happened. I did not intend to listen, but I heard it anyway. And I stood there for a moment with my back against the wall and my eyes on the ceiling, and I let the complexity of it move through me without trying to resolve it. He was a bad husband. He was still Elijah's father. Those two things were both true, and they did not cancel each other out. And I had decided somewhere in the week since March 28th that I was not going to spend energy trying to make them into one clean thing. Some things are two things. You place them both on the board, and you let them be what they are. On April 22nd, I received a call from Howard Webb. He asked if I would be willing to come in for a conversation about the future direction of Briggs Development Group. He said the board was in the process of evaluating operational leadership on a formal basis. He said my knowledge of the company's financial history and strategic framework was in his assessment unmatched. He said, "Emily, you built this company. I think you know that." I said I would come in. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood for a moment in the quiet house, Elijah napping in the downstairs room, cardinals at the feeder outside the oak tree moving in a wind I could not hear, and I thought about the woman who had stood at a fundraiser at Grady Hospital 11 years ago, and talked to a man in a charcoal suit for 2 hours because he had a laugh that carried across a room and a smile that had 2 settings, and she had found the smaller one irresistible. She had paid attention. She had just taken a long time to understand what she was paying attention to. The meeting with Howard Webb was on April 28th, a Monday at 10 a.m. The Briggs Development Group offices were on the 17th floor of a building on Peachtree Center Avenue. Marcus had signed the lease in 2020 during a period when the company was doing well enough that the address felt like a statement. I had been to the office dozens of times over the years, always arriving quietly, always leaving the same way, always the person in the background of the photographs Marcus posted after the ribbon cuttings and the project launches and the check presentations. I had never walked through the front door, feeling like I was arriving at something that was mine. I parked on level 3 of the adjacent deck. I took the elevator up. I wore a deep charcoal blazer and black trousers and the small gold earrings Elijah had given me for my birthday 2 years ago. Studs with a tiny star on each one that he had picked out himself from a jewelry counter at Lenox Square, with his allowance money presenting them to me in a folded piece of paper towel he had used as a gift bag. I wore them on days when I needed to remember what mattered and to whom. The receptionist, a young woman named Brianna, who had been with the company for 2 years and who I had spoken to on the phone more times than she knew, looked up when I came in and said, "Miss Briggs, Mr. Webb is expecting you." I said, "Thank you, Brianna." She looked at me for a moment, with an expression I recognized as the specific look of someone who has been watching events unfold from a proximity that affords information but not permission to speak. Then she smiled, a real one, and gestured toward the conference room. Howard Webb was already there, along with a woman I did not recognize, whom he introduced as Sylvia Okafor, a corporate governance consultant his firm had brought in to assist with the transition evaluation. Sylvia was in her 50s, precise and unhurried, with the kind of stillness that belongs to people who have spent a long time in rooms where important things are decided and have learned that stillness is its own form of authority. She reminded me slightly of Patricia. Howard had prepared an agenda. 5 items. I had prepared nothing which was intentional. I knew the material well enough that preparation would have been performance, and I had no interest in performing for anyone in that room. We went through the agenda methodically. Howard presented the current operational status of the company, the active projects, the contracted obligations, the staffing structure, the financial position as of April 15th, following the account restructuring. He presented it clearly and without editorializing, and I noticed as he went through it that the numbers were largely what I had expected. The company was sound. The company had always been sound because I had kept it sound, and the transition had not disrupted that because Patricia and I had taken considerable care to ensure the transition would not disrupt it. When Howard finished, he looked at me and said, "You know all of this already." I said, "Most of it." He said, "Sylvia and I have been discussing the question of permanent leadership. The board has considered several options." He paused. "I want to be direct with you, Emily. There is a version of this where we bring in external leadership, and you consult in a financial advisory capacity. That is a legitimate path, and I will not pretend otherwise." I said, "But," he said, "but the honest assessment is that external leadership would spend the first 18 months learning what you already know. The company's institutional knowledge lives in you. The client relationships that are still active are active in part because those clients have interacted with your work, even when they believed they were interacting with Marcus's. And the financial framework you built is sophisticated enough that replicating the understanding of it would take considerable time we do not have." Sylvia said in the measured tone of a consultant who has formed a view and is ready to state it, "Miss Briggs, in my assessment, you have been functioning as the effective operational mind of this company for a minimum of 4 years. The question in front of the board is not whether you are capable of leading it. The question is whether you want to. The room was quiet for a moment. I looked at the conference table. It was the same table I had sat at twice before, once to review a loan package in 2021, once to go over quarterly projections with Marcus and an external auditor in 2022. Both times, I had sat in a side chair slightly off the main axis of the table, the position of someone present in a supporting capacity. Today I was sitting at the head. I had not planned that. Howard had gestured to the chair when I came in, and I had simply taken it the way you take a chair that is offered without calculating what it meant. But sitting there, looking at the room from that position, I understood that some things do not announce themselves as significant until you are already inside them. I said I want to. The formal appointment was announced on May 3rd. Patricia had reviewed the employment agreement and the equity structure and the governance documentation, and had characteristically found 2 clauses she wanted amended, and one she wanted removed entirely, all of which Howard agreed to without extended negotiation. The announcement went out to the company's clients, partners, and industry contacts. As a brief professional statement, Emily Briggs had been appointed Chief Executive Officer of Briggs Development Group, effective immediately. Howard Webb would continue as a board member in an advisory capacity. The company's operational continuity and project commitments remained unchanged. The response was not what I had expected, which was that there would be modest industry acknowledgement, and then the ordinary quiet of a thing that has settled into its new shape. What happened instead was that the phones rang. Not all the phones, not the Charlotte firm, which had withdrawn and had its own considerations, but the 2 Atlanta firms that had requested delays following the disclosure reached out within 48 hours of the announcement. Both wanted to resume conversations. Both cited the clarity of the new governance structure and the confidence they had in the company's financial management. One of them, a firm called Meridian Capital on West Paces Ferry Road, asked specifically to meet with me directly, which was something they had not requested. When Marcus was at the table, I met with Meridian Capital on May 12th. Their lead partner was a woman named Dr. Constance Ajay, who had built her career in infrastructure investment and who asked the kind of questions that can only be asked by someone who has read every document thoroughly and understood all of them. We talked for 2 hours. She asked about the operational timeline on 2 active projects, about the accounting framework for a third, about how I intended to approach the mixed-use Midtown property that Marcus had been eyeing before the transition. At the end of the meeting, she said, "Miss Briggs, I'm going to be honest with you. We looked at this company for 18 months, and we were never fully comfortable with the governance picture. We are comfortable now." She offered a capital commitment that was 14% larger than the figure that had been on the table for the March 28th meeting. I said I would have Patricia review the term sheet. Dr. Ajay smiled. She said, "Of course." Marcus signed the divorce papers on May 7th. Patricia called me when the signed documents arrived at her office. She said it in the practical tone of a woman who delivers significant news, the way she delivers all news, clearly and without embellishment, because embellishment is a form of taking up space that belongs to the person receiving the information. I was in the backyard when she called. Standing near the oak tree, the same place I had taken every important call for the past 2 months. The late afternoon light was doing something particular to the leaves, that specific golden quality Atlanta gets in the late spring when the heat has arrived, but not yet committed, and the light has a warmth to it that is almost tactile. I said, "Thank you, Patricia." She said, "You did good work, Emily." I said, "We did." She made a small sound that was as close to a laugh as Patricia Whitfield ever got during business hours. And then she said she would send the final documents for my review, and she wished Elijah continued good health, and she hung up. I stood under the oak tree for a while. Elijah came out of the back door 11 minutes later in his sneakers and his NASA t-shirt, moving with the careful deliberateness of a child who has been told to take it easy, but is negotiating the definition of easy with increasing creativity. He had Gerald under one arm. He came and stood beside me under the tree and looked up at it the way he looked at the world puzzle. With the focused attention of someone mapping something large, he said, "Mom." How old do you think this tree is?" I said, "Older than the house. Maybe 100 years. He said, "Did it know the people who lived here before us?" I said, "In its way." He thought about this. He leaned against my side carefully, the way he had learned to lean since the surgery, aware of his own body in a new way, conscious of the repair inside him. He said, "I'm glad we live here." I put my arm around him gently. I said, "Me too, baby. Me too." Above us in the oak tree, Gerald III, the cardinal, landed on a branch and regarded us briefly with one bright eye, decided we were not interesting enough to warrant further attention, and flew away. 6 months after Elijah's surgery, I moved my desk. Not far, just from the corner of the bedroom where I had set up a makeshift home office years ago laptop, balanced on a writing table I had bought secondhand from an estate sale in Kirkwood, to the actual office on the 17th floor of the building on Peachtree Center Avenue. It sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. Every morning I drove in on I-85 and parked on level 3 and took the elevator up and walked through the front door. And Brianna said good morning, and I said good morning back. And I sat at a desk that had my name on the directory by the elevator. And I did the work I had always done, except now I did it with my name. I was attached to it. Elijah thought this was the best development of the entire year. He had visited the office twice once when I went in on a Saturday to review the Meridian Capital documentation, and brought him along because the sitter was unavailable, and once by deliberate invitation on a Thursday afternoon in early September, or rather when the building was quieter and I could show him around properly. The second visit, he wore his NASA t-shirt by choice and carried Gerald in his backpack because he said Gerald should see where the important work happened. He stood at the window of my office and looked out at Atlanta, the skyline, the green of Piedmont Park in the distance, the grid of streets below, with the expression he used for large things he was trying to understand the full size of. He said, "Mom, you can see everything from up here." I said, "That's the idea." He pressed his hand flat against the glass. He said, "Is this yours?" I said, "Yes." He turned around and looked at the room. The desk, the bookshelves. I had not yet fully organized the whiteboard I had installed on the east wall with the early framework of the Midtown project, mapped out in 3 colors of marker. The photograph of him on the corner of the desk, taken the morning of his discharge from Children's Healthcare, Gerald tucked under his arm, and the small lion Deja had given him in his other hand, his face carrying the particular expression of a child who has come through something and knows it. He said, "It looks like you." I did not know exactly what he meant by that. I suspected he meant it as the highest possible compliment. The Meridian Capital Agreement closed in August. The capital infusion was deployed across 3 projects, 2 active developments that Marcus had started and I had been managing, and 1 new acquisition, the Midtown mixed-use property I had identified before the transition, and moved on formally once the governance structure was clean. Dr. Ajay attended the closing in person. She shook my hand and said, "I look forward to seeing what you build." I said, "So do I." Howard Webb, at the October board meeting, the first formal quarterly meeting under my leadership, presented a financial summary that showed the company in the strongest position it had been in since 2019. He presented it without editorializing the way Howard presented everything. But at the end, he looked at me across the conference table and gave a single nod that contained, I thought, approximately 11 years of professional context and a great deal of respect. I gave a single nod back. Darnell attended that meeting by phone. He had relocated to Charlotte for a project of his own in September, the timing coincidental. And he called in from a job site. At the end of the agenda, he said, "Emily, just for the record, I always knew you were the one holding that thing together." There was construction noise behind him, something large and mechanical. He said, "That's all I got. Good meeting." I said, "Good meeting, Darnell." Marcus and I found a rhythm. It took time, and it was not always graceful. And there were weeks when the logistics of co-parenting felt like an engineering problem I had not been given enough information to solve. But Elijah was the constant Elijah's schedule, Elijah's appointments, Elijah's needs which were real and specific, and provided a framework within which Marcus and I could function as the parents we had always been separately from the marriage we no longer were. Marcus had Elijah every other weekend and Wednesday evenings. He had found his footing at a smaller commercial real estate firm, not as a principal, not with his name on the door, but as a senior advisor on acquisition projects which suited his genuine skills, and which, from what I understood, he was doing competently. He had stopped posting on Instagram. He had started calling Elijah every night at 7:30 p.m., which Elijah had come to rely on with the easy certainty of a child who trusts a promise that has been kept consistently enough to become infrastructure. I did not ask Marcus about Amber. I did not need to. That chapter had its own conclusion, and I was not a part of it, and it did not require my attention. What I want to say about Marcus, and I say it not for his sake, but for mine, because telling a story cleanly requires telling the true parts, is that he loved Elijah. That was always real. Whatever else he was, whatever choices he made in the room with his son, he was present in a way he had not been able to be with me. And I have made my peace with that asymmetry. Some people are capable of their best self in one relationship and not another. That is not an excuse. It is just a thing that is true. Elijah did not suffer from it. Elijah healed. His 6-month cardiac checkup was in September. Dr. Anand reviewed the imaging and the function tests and the long chart of his recovery, and she said in the same measured tone she used for everything, the tone of a woman who has learned that people need accuracy more than they need drama, that Elijah's valve repair was holding perfectly, that his heart was strong, that she expected no further intervention for the foreseeable future, possibly the indefinite future. She said, "He's a remarkable kid." I said, "He is." She said, "How are you doing, Emily?" Not just as his mom. I looked at her across the desk in that small examination room with its diagrams of the cardiovascular system on the walls and the October light coming through the single window, and Elijah down the hall getting a follow-up EKG with a technician he had charmed into explaining every setting on the machine. I said, "I'm good. I'm genuinely good." She looked at me for a moment with the clinical attentiveness she usually reserved for her patients. Then she said, "I believe you." I think about the morning a lot. Not the morning of March 4th, though. I think about that too, the waiting room and the clock and the carpet and the 11 calls. I think about a different morning. The morning of March 28th, when I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee and watched Marcus back out of the driveway in his good suit and his polished shoes, and I told him he wouldn't need luck. I meant it as a fact. Not a threat, not a curse, a fact. He wouldn't need luck because what was about to happen had nothing to do with luck. It had to do with attention and documentation and 14 months of careful work and the accumulated weight of 9 years of contribution that I had finally decided to stop leaving unsigned. I have been asked since then by women who heard pieces of the story through the Atlanta networks that carry such things, asked whether I regret any of it, whether the LLC was too far, whether Patricia Whitfield was too thorough, whether I could have simply divorced him and left the company alone. I tell them the truth. The company was mine. Not in the way Marcus's name on the door was his, not in the visible, credited, publicly acknowledged way, but in the way that anything you build with your hands and your mind and your time becomes yours, regardless of whose name the culture decides to put on it. I had built it. I had a right to it. And I had executed that right legally, voluntarily, without deception, because Marcus had signed a document he did not read carefully, which was, and I say this without cruelty, very much on brand for a man who had been not reading things carefully for years. Do I regret the marriage I did for a while? I regret the specific shape it took in its final years, the distance, the coverage, the filling in of blanks. But I do not regret the 11 years that produced Elijah, or the financial knowledge I built in service of a company that is now mine, or the 14 months of careful work that taught me something about my own capacity for patience and strategy that I did not know I had. I do not regret standing at the kitchen window the morning it ended and feeling exactly nothing except certain. What I have come to understand, the thing I would tell anyone who asked, though mostly I do not offer it unsolicited, because wisdom offered without request is just noise, is this: the quietest thing I ever did was pay attention, not to Marcus, not to Amber, not to the receipts or the declined calls or the small withdrawals that accumulate into the portrait of a man who has checked out of something he never fully valued. I paid attention to what I had built. I paid attention to the documents I had signed and the models I had built and the discrepancy I had caught and the loan applications I had structured and the 14 months of legal work that turned a decade of invisible contribution into something that could stand on its own in a room with my name on it in the light. I paid attention to Elijah, his questions, his courage, his puzzle maps, the way he placed Antarctica with careful hands at the bottom of the board, and immediately checked the alignment and corrected it, because he understood that precision matters, that the world is the size it is, regardless of whether you acknowledge it accurately. I paid attention to myself, which was the hardest and the last. On the morning Marcus drove away, and I stood in the kitchen with my cold coffee and my certain hands. I was not a woman who had been wronged executing a revenge. I was a woman who had finally decided that what she had built deserved to have her name on it. That decision, it turns out, changes everything. Elijah asked me once, a few weeks after we had settled into the new shape of our life, whether our family was broken. We were at the kitchen table. The world puzzle was finished by then, all 200 pieces, every continent in its place, every ocean named. It had taken him 3 weeks, and he had done every piece himself, refusing assistance with a quiet determination that reminded me uncomfortably and beautifully of no one so much as myself. I thought about his question for a moment. I thought about what it deserved. I said no. It just looks different than it used to. He looked at the puzzle. He looked at me. He said different can be okay. I said different can be exactly right. He nodded. He picked up Gerald from the table and tucked him under his arm and pushed back his chair and went to get a snack from the pantry, already moving on to the next thing, the way children do when they have received a satisfactory answer and the world has been sufficiently organized for the moment. I sat at the kitchen table alone, in the quiet house, and I listened to him in the pantry, the specific sounds of a child, choosing between options, deliberating with full seriousness over crackers. And I thought, this is what I protected. This ordinary sound. This child in this kitchen, in this house that I built and kept and refused to leave smaller than I found it. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. I am not a person who believes in simple lessons. Life is not a puzzle where all the pieces have obvious shapes, and everything fits cleanly if you just find the right position. I know that now better than I ever have. I have lived a complicated thing, and I have come out the other side of it, not clean, not unmarked, but intact. And I will say this plainly, stronger in the places that were tested. But if I had to say one thing to the woman sitting in a waiting room somewhere right now, holding 11 unanswered calls on her phone and a receipt from a restaurant with a name that means something it should not mean, I would say this: pay attention to what you have built, not to what he is doing, not to who she is or what she looks like or what she has that you do not. Pay attention to your own hands, to the work they have done, to the documents you have signed and the problems you have solved, and the irreplaceable institutional knowledge that lives in you alone. You are not waiting. You are accumulating. And one day when the morning comes that requires it, everything you have accumulated quietly will stand up and speak for itself loudly in a room you were always meant to run. Take care of your children. Take care of your work. Take care of yourself last, and most importantly, because everything else depends on it. The rest has a way of taking care of itself.